Growing up, our babysitter would take my sister and I to the swimming pool along with her 5 kids during the summer. She'd pack a whole loaf of sandwiches and a giant bag of chips. We'd have a picnic in the park and then spend the afternoon at the swimming pool. Our park had a regular pool and then additionally a wading pool off to the side that seemed huge to a 4 or 5-year-old. I remember one year as I approached my 5th or 6th birthday, I decided that I was feeling like one of the big kids. I was going to prove how brave I was by going across the swimming pool at the very center where the water was the deepest. Somehow, someone had loosened the cover over the center drain. I'm walking across the pool and I felt the grate under my feet. I thought I'd hit the deepest part and I was in the clear. But I took one more step and the bottom disappeared. The suction from the filter pumps was just enough to keep me from pulling myself up out of that hole. I was in a panic and struggled for what seemed like an eternity, trying to get out. I remember looking up and seeing the sky reflected on the water over my head. It was right there, but I couldn't get to it. Luckily, one of the older boys noticed my dilemma, grabbed my arms, pulling hard enough to break the suction and pull me up out of the water. I decided right then that I was terrified of any water that was deeper than my chest. A couple years later, my parents enrolled me in swimming lessons. The rest of the kids quickly advanced through all of the stations and were going off the diving board in no time whatsoever. I was stuck in the lowest group for quite a while, not doing much more than holding my breath and opening my eyes underwater. I just couldn't stand not being able to get all the air that I wanted. Over the years, I managed to do a few things around water. Let me back up just a moment. The same time I was taking those swimming lessons was about the first time that I remember seeing the undersea world of Jacque Cousteau. Being able to be underwater and interact with the marine life seemed like the coolest thing in the world. I had dreams of interacting with dolphins and whales and turtles and fish. And I thought that scuba diving was going to be the answer to my fear of water. I remember discovering that my grandfather's fishing catalogs had scuba gear in them. And I wore out the pages of that catalog, making exhaustive lists of all of the items of scuba gear that I was going to need, and figuring out how many lawns I'd have to mow to buy it all. That scuba gear, those catalogs, went everywhere with me, including swimming lessons. My friends and I would sit there and go over the merits of all of the items in the scuba listings. I told everybody that I was going to be a marine biologist. I was obsessed. Other than living in Iowa, the only problem was all of this was happening on the side of the pool, not in it. I was still terrified of water. Over the years, I managed to do a few things around water. Boating, fishing, taking my kids to water parks. I never realized how much my fear of water affected me until sometime in my 30s, I was on a ferry in Puget Sound. I was leaning on the railing, enjoying the scenery, when we happened upon a buoy that had a bunch of sea lions on it. I was fascinated, so I leaned out a little bit further to see better, and the captain of the ship came on the loudspeaker and said, that buoy was anchored to the bottom of Puget Sound, 900 feet down. Unconsciously, I felt myself backing up. And the next thing I knew, my back was pressed tight against the pilot house of the ship. And that's where I stayed until we got to the dock on the other side. Several years later, my wife and I would go every spring to a beach resort for a vacation to kind of get away. I'd sit and I'd watch the intro to scuba demo on the side of the pool. And one day, while the divers were going off into the ocean, I said to my wife, someday I'm still gonna do that. The next day, as we were lounging around the pool, the diving instructor came by, saw us sitting there, got this big grin on her face, and came over. She used my own words, someday I'm gonna do that, against me to convince us to take the scuba demo in the pool. So we put on all the scuba gear and managed to swim a couple laps around the pool. It was really cool. I was finally getting to breathe underwater. But when she suggested that we do it in the ocean the next day, I was really relieved to say, we're flying home in the morning, so that's not possible. It gave me a way out of being in water where my feet couldn't touch the ground. The following year, as we were planning our vacation, I discovered that we were going to be very close to one of what they said was the most beautiful coral reefs in the world. I mentioned this to my wife, who knew about my fear of water, but we decided to go ahead and book an intro to scuba adventure anyway. I booked it immediately and paid in advance. I wasn't going to let myself back out this time. The night before, we were both very, very nervous and got very little sleep. My wife was even up sick most of the night because of nerves. The following morning, we had our coffee, gathered up our gear, got in the car ready to go. We had no training, no certification, and no idea how much we didn't know. We spent most of the morning going through the basics. And finally, after several attempts in the pool, the instructor decided that we had achieved a kind of a lame competency, and it was time to go. Over lunch, we almost talked each other out of it, but the assistant diving instructor managed to instill some courage, and so we decided to go ahead and go. The ride out to the dive site took about 30 minutes, and the instructors continued to reassure us the entire way. And we finally arrived. It was time to go. I was the first one to take that giant stride off of the side of the boat. I dropped down into the water with about 60 pounds of gear on my back and swam back up just like they had told us to. As I got to the surface, I got hit by a wave that knocked the air hose out of my mouth and pushed me back underwater. I looked up and I saw the sky reflected on the water over my head, and that 5-year-old panicked person came back. I hit the inflate button on my vest and I dumped, I think, half of my tank of air into that vest, and it popped me up to the top and above the water so I could get a breath. My wife was bobbing right there waiting for the rest of the group. And she looked at me and she said, "I don't think I'm so sure about this." I said, you know, I'm not either. Let's get back in the boat and just forget about this. I don't care about the refund. But the diving instructor wouldn't have any of that. He reminded me that this was something that I had wanted to do for nearly 50 years. And I shouldn't not do it. So I decided finally that I was going to give it a shot. I'd gone this far. So I put my air hose back in my mouth. I put my face down in the water. And I looked down in the bottom, and I saw this little blue wavy thing on the bottom about 30 feet down. I just had to know what it was. So I let the air out of my vest, started going down, again, looking up, seeing the sky reflected on the water as it closed over my head. This time it didn't bother me. Well, at least not as much. We both had a death grip on the descent line all the way to the bottom. Just as we got there, a green sea turtle swam past. We completely forgot everything and turned to start following that turtle. Luckily, the dive instructors grabbed us and pulled us back in. We were incredibly awkward, trying to maintain control in a constant level. The two dive instructors that were with us herded us along like a couple of guppies just learning to swim. Along the way, they pointed out all the things that we probably otherwise would have missed because we were too worried about everything else. But we saw pufferfish, parrotfish, crabs, tangs, clownfish, grouper, things that we'd only ever seen in aquariums or in pictures. There were so many things to see that sometimes we had trouble deciding what to see first or where to look first. Our second dive that afternoon was even more incredible. The coral formations were amazing, and there were fish of every shape and color that we could have imagined. We even saw a giant Caribbean lobster, and I remember just thinking, gosh, I'd like to take him to dinner. At the end of the day, my wife decided that it was a lot of fun, but once was enough for her. Not me. I was hooked. I was finally getting to be Jacque freaking Cousteau. That following winter, I spent 8 weeks getting my dive certification. The final exam was swimming or diving in an abandoned, flooded mine where we swam over some areas that were over 350 feet deep. I've since done several scuba dives and seen most of the things on the original list of fish that I wanted to see, including a 9-foot tiger shark that swam past just about 20 feet from me. I'd always wondered what would happen when I saw something like that. Would that panicked 5-year-old show up again? But the only thing that I could think of was, this is so cool. I'm finally getting to see all this stuff under the water. I decided right at that moment that you never are too old to overcome the fears that you face, especially when they stand in the way of something that you've wanted to do your entire life. You just have to get your air, put your face back in the water, and see all the things that that fear has been making you miss. And by the way, I never did figure out what that little blue thing was. Thank you.